Listen, the sound of a dying diesel engine isn't just a mechanical failure. In the high-stakes theater of the American Midwest, it's the sound of a legacy crumbling into the dirt, while the rest of the world watches with a stopwatch and a smirk. It was late April, that volatile stretch of the spring season where the frost is finally losing its grip on the black Iowa soil, leaving the fields a treacherous soup of meltwater and clay that can swallow a dually truck up to its axles if you aren't careful. Silas Thorne sat in the high-back seat of his 1974 Case 2470 Traction King, a white and orange behemoth that looked like a relic of a forgotten industrial war, feeling the rhythmic shudder of the 504 cubic inch turbocharged engine turn into a violent metal-on-metal scream before falling into a deafening, hollow silence. Outside the cab, the world was moving on without him. Just 50 yards past his property line, a fleet of brand-new, high-visibility yellow excavators and graders were humming with the precision of a Swiss watch, tearing into the earth where the Miller and Henderson farms used to stand. Those families had taken the state's buyout checks years ago, moving to the suburbs with their pockets full of progress money, but Silas had dug his heels in, becoming the lone holdout on a 5-mile stretch of what was supposed to be the new Interstate 88 corridor.
The humiliation didn't come from the breakdown itself. Every farmer knows the temper of old iron. It came from the fact that the foreman of the highway crew, a man half Silas's age named Garrett, with a clean hard hat and a clip-on tie, was currently leaning against the fence line, recording the whole pathetic scene on his smartphone. Silas could see the man's teeth flash in a grin from across the ditch. The Old Man Thorne legend was finally breaking down in the mud, unable to even move his rig out of the path of the surveyors who were already hammering stakes into the soft April earth just inches from his fence. The Case 2470 was more than a tractor to Silas. It was the last moving part of a family history that spanned 4 generations. But in that moment, as the smell of burnt hydraulic fluid and scorched bearings wafted into the cab, it felt like a heavy iron casket. 20 years ago, the government had mapped out this route, promising the town that a 4-lane highway would bring jobs and connectivity, and one by one, the red barns and silver silos that lined the county road were bulldozed into history, leaving Silas's 400 acres as a jagged tooth in a mouth of gravel and asphalt. He had survived the lawsuits, the imminent domain threats, and the cold shoulders at the local diner, but he hadn't prepared for the betrayal of his own machinery at the exact moment the state's patience finally ran out. As Silas climbed down the ladder, his boots sinking 6 inches into the cold spring muck, he heard the hiss of the air brakes from a nearby lowboy trailer and the mocking shout of the foreman telling him they'd be happy to scrap that junk for him if he couldn't get it out of the right-of-way by sunset. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the 20 tons of stalled steel behind him. He looked at the massive 24-inch tires of the Traction King, now motionless as the surrounding landscape echoed with the roar of the machines that were literally erasing his neighbor's footprints from the map. It wasn't just a tractor that had died, it was the illusion that he could hold back the tide of time with nothing but grit and an old technical manual. He stood there in the wind, a solitary figure against the vast, gray April sky, while the foreman's laughter was drowned out by the thunder of a demolition charge, leveling the last standing silo on the horizon, signaling that the Road of Ghosts was officially open for business, and Silas Thorne was the only obstacle left in its path. By the time the sun began to dip behind the jagged silhouette of the skeletal overpass being built to the west, the pressure didn't just feel like a looming deadline. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on Silas's chest, making every breath of the damp, diesel-soaked air a struggle. Garrett, the foreman, didn't stay on his side of the fence for long. He hopped the wire with a grace that only comes from someone who hasn't spent 40 years climbing in and out of tractor cabs, and he slapped a neon orange notice of immediate obstruction onto the cracked glass of the case's windshield. According to the fine print on that laminated sheet of bureaucracy, Silas had exactly 24 hours to remove the non-functional debris from what the state now legally defined as the construction corridor's buffer zone. If the Traction King wasn't gone by 8 o'clock the following morning, a state-contracted heavy recovery crew would be dispatched to drag it to a municipal impound lot, or more likely, a scrapyard. And the cost of that recovery, estimated at nearly $12,000, would be attached as a lien against Silas's remaining land. Garrett didn't even try to hide the satisfaction in his voice when he told Silas that his stubbornness was finally out of runway.
implying that the state had been waiting for a mechanical failure just like this to finally break the back of the last holdout on the ghost road. Silas tried to keep his hands from shaking as he pulled his flip phone from his pocket to call the only person who might be able to help, the service manager at the regional equipment dealership. But the voice on the other end of the line wasn't the friendly, gravelly tone of Old Man Miller, who used to extend credit on a handshake and a prayer. It was a sterile, mid-level coordinator at a corporate headquarters 3 states away who informed Silas that Miller's ag power had been absorbed by a global conglomerate 6 months prior. They didn't do field calls for machines manufactured before the turn of the century anymore. And even if they did, their policy strictly forbade sending service trucks into active construction zones due to liability insurance complexities. When Silas begged for just a heavy-duty tow to get the 20-ton beast onto his own gravel drive, the coordinator quoted him a flat fee of $15,000, payable upfront via credit card, because recovery of vintage articulated units in unstable soil conditions fell under their specialized industrial tier. Silas looked at the muddy field, then at his bank balance, a dwindling sum that was supposed to cover his seed corn and the property taxes that had tripled since the highway project began, and he realized the trap was closing. The risk wasn't just losing the tractor, it was losing the season. In the high-stakes gamble of Midwest farming, if your corn isn't in the ground during that crucial late April window, the heat of July will scorch the tassels before they can pollinate, leaving you with nothing but dried stalks and a mountain of debt. The state knew this. They weren't just building a road, they were starving him out, using the breakdown of a 50-year-old transmission as the catalyst for his final ruin. The silence that followed Garrett's departure was even worse than his mocking laughter. It was the sound of a countdown. Silas crawled back under the massive belly of the case, his coveralls immediately soaking up the frigid, oily water of the spring thaw, and he stared up at the complex maze of the power shift transmission. He could see the problem, a ruptured main pressure line that had likely starved the clutch packs. But the bolt heads were rusted into unrecognizable knobs of iron, and the specialized wrench required to reach them had probably been out of production since the Reagan administration. Every time a car sped by on the existing county road, its headlights momentarily illuminating the CASE logo on the side of the hood, Silas felt like a captain on a sinking ship that everyone else had already abandoned. His neighbors were gone, their houses replaced by stacks of concrete drainage pipes and piles of crushed limestone. And now his only ally, this 1974 Traction King, was bleeding its lifeblood into the Iowa mud. He had 16 hours left before the state's tow trucks arrived to tear his history apart. And for the first time in 20 years, Silas Thorne felt the cold, sharp edge of true despair, wondering if the government was right. Maybe some things are just meant to be bulldozed over in the name of a future that has no room for the past. The midnight air was a jagged blade against Silas's face as he lay on a piece of sodden plywood tucked beneath the massive belly of the Case 2470. The darkness of the Iowa field was total, broken only by the flickering, weak yellow beam of a magnetic worklight that kept sliding off the oily frame. As he wiped a mixture of grit and hydraulic fluid from his eyes, Silas realized his initial diagnosis had been too optimistic. It wasn't just a ruptured line. The main suction manifold, a heavy cast iron throat that fed the heart of the power shift transmission, had developed a hairline fracture that was sucking air like a dying man gasping for breath. In the modern world of farming, this was a total loss scenario, a repair that required a clean room environment, a gantry crane, and a 3-week lead time for a part that hadn't been cast in 40 years. The Traction King was designed with a sophisticated, closed-center hydraulic system that was ahead of its time. But that complexity meant that without a perfect vacuum in the suction line, the clutch packs would never engage, leaving the 20-ton machine a permanent monument to a bygone era. Silas looked at his watch. 3:15 a.m. In less than 5 hours, the state's heavy-duty rotators would be backing down the haul road to claim their prize. He felt the cold mud seeping through his layers of wool and denim, and for a moment, he considered just closing his eyes and letting the highway consume it all. But then, his flashlight beam caught a glimpse of a specific casting mark on the side of the transmission housing, a small, threaded brass plug that most operators had forgotten even existed. It was an emergency prime port, a relic of the 1970s design philosophy where engineers assumed the man in the seat was also the man with the wrench. Silas scrambled out from under the machine, his knees popping like dry kindling, and sprinted toward the darkened silhouette of his machine shed. He ignored the rows of newer, smaller utility tractors and dove into a pile of junk that had belonged to his grandfather. A collection of brass fittings, copper tubing, and heavy-duty plumbing valves salvaged from a 1950s-era grain dryer. He was looking for a specific, high-pressure check valve and a length of reinforced braided hose. He found them at the bottom of a rusted 5-gallon bucket, buried under a nest of old spark plug wires. The old method he was about to attempt was a desperate improvised bypass that ignored every safety protocol in the modern technician's handbook. He wasn't going to fix the manifold. He was going to create an external, pressurized IV bag for the transmission. By tapping into that forgotten port and using an old, hand-cranked fuel transfer pump to manually force hydraulic fluid into the transmission's primary gallery, he could potentially bypass the suction leak and slug the clutch packs into locking long enough to limp the machine out of the mud. It was a violent, imprecise fix that could just as easily blow the seals out of the entire unit. But as the first gray light of a misty Iowa morning began to bleed over the horizon, Silas knew it was the only way to save the king from the scrapyard. The technical execution was a nightmare of frozen fingers and stripped threads. Silas had to use a hand-cranked drill to widen the orifice of the brass plug while lying in the muck, the metal shavings falling onto his chest like hot sparks. He rigged the 5-gallon bucket of fresh 10W40 oil to the side of the cab using a length of baling wire, creating a gravity-fed reservoir that looked like a steampunk experiment. He connected the braided hose, hand-tightened the fittings until his knuckles bled, and then climbed into the cab. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the ozone of a coming storm. When he turned the key, the 504 cubic-inch diesel engine groaned, the starter motor fighting against the cold, thickened oil. Silas didn't just turn the key. He spoke to the machine, a low, rhythmic plea for one more hour of service. On the third attempt, the engine roared to life, a cloud of black soot erupting from the vertical stack and punching a hole through the morning fog. But the tractor didn't move. The hydraulic pressure gauge stayed pinned at 0, the needle vibrating with a frantic metallic chatter. Silas realized the manual pump wasn't enough. He needed a hydrostatic shock to clear the air pocket. He reached out the cab window, grabbed the handle of the hand pump he'd rigged to the side, and began to crank with every ounce of strength in his 70-year-old frame, his heart hammering against his ribs in time with the throb of the engine, waiting for the moment the old iron would either wake up or explode. The clock on the dashboard of the state-contracted heavy recovery rig struck 8 a.m. with a digital finality that felt like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. Silas heard the synchronized hiss of air brakes as two massive, tri-axle Peterbilt rotators, the kind of machines designed to upright overturned semi-trucks on the turnpike, backed toward his fence line, their amber beacons pulsing against the morning mist like the eyes of predatory insects. Garrett was already standing at the edge of the ditch, his smartphone raised, surrounded by a dozen high-vis-clad crew members who had stopped their grading work to witness the final eviction of the old man of the Ghost Road. The skepticism in the air was thick enough to choke on. To these men, Silas Thorne was a punchline, a stubborn ghost haunting a construction site that had already moved into the 21st century. But inside the cab of the Case 2470, the atmosphere was different. It was a pressure cooker of heat, the smell of scorched oil, and the desperate, rhythmic clank of Silas's hand pump. His shoulder was screaming in protest, his vision blurring from the exertion, but he didn't stop. He watched the needle on the improvised pressure gauge flicker, then jump, then finally stabilize in the green zone as the manual priming port finally forced the air out of the transmission's parched heart. He reached for the heavy iron range selector lever, and with a grunt of pure, unadulterated will, he shoved the Traction King into low-range four-wheel drive. The sound that followed was something the witnesses would talk about at the local tavern for years to come. It wasn't the sound of a modern tractor's polite hum. It was a primal, metallic roar that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath the highway crew's feet. The massive 24-inch tires didn't just turn. They clawed at the April mud, throwing 6-foot plumes of black Iowa earth into the air as the articulated chassis groaned and twisted under the sudden, violent application of torque. The Peterbilt drivers stopped their winches mid-pull, their mouths hanging open as the scrap heap they were sent to collect suddenly lurched forward, its orange and white paint gleaming through the grime like the hide of a wounded but vengeful tiger. Silas didn't just move the machine out of the buffer zone, he drove it straight toward the property line, clearing the path with a foot to spare, effectively nullifying the legal grounds for the impoundment. The crowd of skeptics fell silent, the mocking laughter replaced by a stunned, professional respect for a machine and a man that refused to die. Garrett lowered his phone, the smug grin wiped clean from his face as he realized the viral demolition video he'd been hoping for had just turned into a masterclass in field expedient engineering. But the reputation shift wasn't complete until the head engineer of the entire interstate project, a gray-haired man in a suit protected by a long trench coat, stepped out of a black SUV and walked past the stunned foreman to stare at the ground where Silas had just been. The engineer wasn't looking at the tractor, he was looking at the massive, swirling vortex of water that was suddenly erupting from the trench his crew had dug just 10 feet from Silas's fence. In their haste to bulldoze the neighboring farms and flatten the landscape for the new corridor, the state's surveyors had ignored Silas's 20-year-old warnings about the subterranean limestone shelf and the ancient, unmapped tiles that drained the valley. By removing the Miller and Henderson homesteads, they had inadvertently destroyed the delicate hydraulic balance of the entire township. Now, as the April thaw accelerated, the road of ghosts was literally liquefying from beneath. A multi-million-dollar section of the new highway's subbase was sagging into a sinkhole that was growing by the minute, and the state's high-tech, GPS-guided excavators were already beginning to tilt dangerously into the muck. The engineer turned from the disaster and looked up at Silas, who was still sitting high in the cab of the case, his hand still gripping the manual pump. The man didn't bark an order or wave a legal document. Instead, he took off his hard hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked toward the mud-caked ladder of the 2470 with his hand outstretched in a gesture that was unmistakable to anyone watching. The government hadn't just come to watch him fail. They had realized that in their rush to pave over the past, they had buried the only person who knew how to stop the future from sinking into the Iowa mud. The begging hadn't started with words, but with the desperate, panicked look in the engineer's eyes as he realized the only machine in the county heavy enough and stable enough to reach their sinking equipment, and the only man who knew where the ancient drainage lines were buried, was the one they had tried to destroy just an hour before. The state engineer didn't offer a handshake. He offered a desperate, ink-smudged contract on a clipboard that gave Silas more power in 30 seconds than 2 decades of eminent domain battles ever had. The emergency consulting fee alone, written in the frantic handwriting of a man watching his career sink into a limestone cavern, was enough to pay off Silas's back taxes and finally rebuild the machine shed that had been leaking since the 90s. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was the look on the foreman Garrett's face as he was ordered to unhook his own high-tech recovery chains and stand aside while the old man with the junk tractor took charge of the scene. Silas didn't gloat. He simply adjusted his grease-stained cap and pointed toward the swirling vortex where the new interstate was disappearing into the ground. He told them that the Road of Ghosts was reclaiming its territory because they'd tried to fight the water instead of working with it, and he wasn't going to move a single clod of dirt until the state agreed to a permanent drainage easement that would protect his acreage from their runoff forever. With the roar of a sinking $600,000 excavator screaming in the background, the engineer signed the paper on the hood of the case. Silas then put the Traction King back to work, the improvised bypass hose bulging with every stroke of his manual hand pump as he backed the white and orange giant into the maw of the sinkhole. It was a feat of mechanical defiance. The 2470 didn't just pull the state's high-tech machine out of the mire. It did so with a steady, rhythmic power that made the modern equipment look like plastic toys. For 3 hours, Silas directed the crew, showing them exactly where the hand-laid clay tiles from the early 20th century were buried, the secret map of the land that no satellite or ground-penetrating radar had been able to find. By the time the sun hit its zenith, the sinkhole was stabilized, the state's fleet was on solid ground, and the hierarchy of the Ghost Road had been permanently rewritten. The emotional weight of the victory didn't truly hit Silas until the last state truck had pulled away and the construction site was quiet once again. He stood by the case 2470, the engine finally cool, and he ran a hand over the orange paint that was now chipped and scarred from the morning's battle. The tractor had survived, but it was exhausted. the improvised bypass leaking a slow, steady drip of oil onto the grass, like a warrior bleeding after a long campaign.
It was a reminder that nothing lasts forever, but some things are worth fighting for until the very last revolution of the crank. The lesson he learned, and the one that echoed through the town long after the pavement was finally dry, was that progress isn't measured by how fast you can build, but by what you're willing to save along the way. In a world obsessed with the newest, the fastest, and the most disposable, there is still a sacred place for the things that are built to endure. Silas Thorne had saved his farm, not with a lawyer or a politician, but with the strength of his hands and the soul of a machine that everyone else had forgotten how to love. He had proven that the government might own the road, but the man who knows the land beneath it will always be the one who truly holds the map. As the late April breeze began to cool and the shadows of the overpass lengthened across his fields, Silas climbed the ladder one last time to pull the obstruction notice off his windshield, crumpling the neon orange paper into a ball and tossing it into the mud. He looked toward the horizon, where the silos of his neighbors had once stood, and he felt a quiet sense of peace that he hadn't known since the first surveyors arrived 20 years ago. The ghost road was still coming, but it would have to curve around him now, a permanent tribute to a man who refused to be bulldozed. He knew there would be more challenges, more breakdowns, and more battles with the passage of time. But for today, the land was safe, and the iron was silent. The legacy of the Thorne farm wasn't just in the soil or the deed. It was in the resilience of a spirit that couldn't be broken by bureaucrats or the relentless march of time. He turned the key one more time, just to hear the engine purr, a soft, confident rumble that told him they were both ready for whatever the next season would bring. The story of the holdout on the highway wasn't a tragedy of loss. It was a cinematic triumph of the human spirit over the cold machinery of the state. Tell us in the comments, have you ever seen a piece of obsolete machinery outshine a modern one when the chips were down?